The moment I saw the for sale sign staked into my sister's front lawn, my stomach twisted into a knot so tight I could barely breathe. The house, the one she had poured her heart into, the one she had fought to keep standing through late mortgage payments and broken water pipes, the one where Mom planted her rose bushes before she got sick, wasn't for sale. Not legally, not willingly. But there it was, bold red letters against the crisp white sign, standing like a grave marker for everything my family had worked for. My hands clenched into fists as I stared at the notice taped to the front door, the ink sharp and smug in its official authority. Transfer of ownership. Effective immediately. My sister didn't even know. She was still at the hospital, holding Mom's fragile hand, whispering reassurances that everything would be okay, completely unaware that while she had been fighting to keep our mother alive, someone had swooped in like a vulture and stolen her home right out from under her. It wasn't hard to guess who was behind it. Karen Davidson, HOA president, local dictator, and self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac, had been circling like a shark ever since Mom's condition worsened and Sarah had been forced to spend more time at the hospital. The warnings had come quietly at first: petty fines, cryptic emails, letters citing nonsense HOA violations that made less sense than a toddler's doodles. An unauthorized trellis in the garden, a non-compliant mailbox identical to everyone else's, a disruptive shade of blue on the front door that had been there since before the HOA even existed. I had deleted those emails, assuming they were nothing more than Karen's usual power trip. But now, as I stood on the porch of my sister's stolen home, staring at the legal jargon detailing its sudden and unjust sale, I realized I had made a terrible mistake. A low cough made me turn. Mrs. Chun, our elderly neighbor, stood at the edge of her yard, wringing her hands together. "James," she whispered, glancing around nervously. "They came early this morning. Men in suits." Karen was with them, pointing at everything like she already owned it. My blood ran cold. "Did Sarah sign anything?" I demanded, though I already knew the answer. Mrs. Chun shook her head. "She's been with your mother the whole time." "But Karen," she hesitated, her voice dropping even lower. "Karen's done this before." A prickle of unease crept up my spine. I took out my phone, scrolling through my messages, searching for any sign that my sister had been informed of this. Nothing. Not a single call, not a single text. Just silence. I pulled up Sarah's HOA emails, checking the last correspondence. The messages had stopped weeks ago. The most recent one had been forwarded to an unfamiliar address. KarenHoaPresident@email.com. My fingers tightened around the phone. I marched toward the HOA office, my pulse hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The small, overly pristine building sat in the middle of the community like some kind of bureaucratic temple, its white walls and glass doors gleaming in the midday sun. I pushed through the entrance, barely noticing the receptionist's startled look as I strode straight to Karen's office. She was there, of course, seated behind her oversized mahogany desk, flipping through paperwork with a satisfied smirk that made my skin crawl. "Ah, James," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "What a surprise. How can I help you?" I slapped the transfer notice onto her desk. "Explain this." Karen barely glanced at it. "Oh, that. The property had outstanding violations and unpaid dues. The HOA board made the decision to." "Lies," I snapped. "Sarah's payments were automatic. And those violations? Manufactured nonsense. You've been targeting her for weeks. And now you've stolen her house while she's at the hospital with our dying mother?" Karen gave an exaggerated sigh, as if I were a petulant child throwing a tantrum. James. Rules are rules. Homeowners must comply with HOA standards. If Sarah was unable to maintain her property, she didn't sell her home. The transfer is legally binding, Karen said smoothly, but her grip on her pen tightened, her knuckles turning white. She failed to respond to multiple warnings. The HOA has the authority to. The HOA doesn't have the authority to steal someone's home, I interrupted, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. And I'm going to prove it. Karen's smirk wavered for half a second before snapping back into place. "You're welcome to try," she said, her tone clipped, her eyes narrowing. I turned on my heel and left, but the second I stepped outside, I pulled out my phone and dialed. "Tom," I said the moment he picked up. "I need every document you can find on Sarah's house. HOA records, property records, emails, anything. I don't care how deep we have to dig. Karen's behind this, and I'm going to bring her down." I hung up before he could respond, my jaw tightening as I looked back at my sister's house, her stolen house. Karen thought she had won. She thought she could manipulate the rules, twist them in her favor, take whatever she wanted without consequence. But she had made one fatal mistake. She had underestimated just how far I was willing to go to stop her. I spent the next 24 hours drowning in paperwork, sifting through every document, email, and transaction history connected to Sarah's house. What I found made my blood boil. Karen hadn't just changed the mailing address for Sarah's HOA notices. She had rerouted all official HOA communications to a private email under her control. Every violation, every fine, every so-called warning had been deliberately hidden from my sister. The so-called unpaid dues that justified the sale? Manufactured. The violations? Arbitrary nonsense that Karen had conveniently used against other homeowners before. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern. And Sarah wasn't the first victim. The Johnsons, the Hendersons, the Wilsons, families who had suffered some form of hardship, an accident, a long hospital stay, an unexpected death, had all mysteriously lost their homes under similar circumstances. And every single one of those houses had been transferred to shell companies that all traced back to one real estate firm. A firm owned by Karen's husband. My hands were shaking as I stared at the records on my laptop, the tangled web of fraud and theft so blatant it almost seemed laughable. Karen hadn't even bothered to cover her tracks properly. Maybe because up until now, no one had ever fought back. No one had questioned her authority, her carefully crafted image as the queen of the HOA. She had made a career out of bullying people, out of leveraging nonsense fines and technicalities to force struggling families out of their homes so she and her husband could snatch them up for pennies on the dollar. And now, she thought she could do the same to Sarah. She thought I would stand by and watch it happen. I slammed my laptop shut and grabbed my car keys. If Karen wanted a fight, she was about to get one. The HOA office was quiet when I arrived, the receptionist shooting me a wary glance as I marched past her desk toward the back office. Karen was inside, sipping tea from a ridiculous floral cup, a smug smile already plastered across her face. "James," she said, not even looking up. "You really must stop barging in like this. It's becoming a habit." I dropped a thick folder onto her desk, watching with satisfaction as she raised an eyebrow. "You've been busy," she mused, flipping through the documents with an air of boredom. Then, as she recognized the records, the smirk faltered. "Just for a second. But I saw it. The Wilsons," I said, voice steady. "The Johnsons. The Hendersons. All forced out under suspiciously similar circumstances. All of their properties transferred to Highland Development LLC. Your husband's company." Karen shut the folder with a sharp snap. "I have no idea what you're implying." I leaned forward. "I think you know exactly what I'm implying. You've been running a real estate scam, using your position as HOA president to manufacture violations, push families into foreclosure, and then conveniently selling the houses to your husband's firm." I pointed at the folder. "It's all there. And I'm betting if I dig deeper, I'll find even more." Karen's smile returned, but it was thinner now, forced. "James," she said, her voice dipping into that infuriatingly condescending tone, "you really don't understand how HOAs work. Everything we do is within the rules. If homeowners fail to meet community standards..." "Cut the crap, Karen," I snapped. "Sarah's house isn't just her house. It's in our family trust. You had no legal right to sell it. And now, because of your arrogance, you've backed yourself into a corner." Karen's eyes flickered, just for a second, before she leaned back, crossing her arms. "Let's say, hypothetically, there were some misunderstandings," she mused. "What exactly do you think you're going to do about it?" I pulled out my phone and played the recording. Her voice crystal clear, bragging to her friend over coffee about flipping 3 other homes through HOA technicalities. Laughing about how easy it was to push people out when they were too distracted by personal struggles to fight back. Karen's face drained of color. I pocketed my phone. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "You're going to reverse the sale of Sarah's house. You're going to send out an official statement admitting the errors in your paperwork. And then you're going to resign." Karen laughed, but it was hollow now, a forced chuckle meant to cover up the rising panic in her eyes. "And if I don't?" I smiled. "Then I take this to the press, to the police, to every homeowner you've ever screwed over. And I promise you, Karen, when I'm done, you won't just lose your position on the HOA. You'll lose everything." Karen's hands clenched around the edge of her desk. For the first time, she looked uncertain. Trapped. And I knew I had her. But I wasn't finished. I turned to leave, pausing at the door. Oh, and Karen? I glanced back. That emergency HOA meeting you scheduled for tomorrow? I'll be there. And I'm bringing some friends. I walked out without waiting for a response, my heart pounding with adrenaline. Karen thought she had built an empire of control, that she was untouchable. But the cracks were starting to show. And by tomorrow, I was going to bring the whole thing crashing down. By the time I arrived at the emergency HOA meeting, the air inside the clubhouse was thick with tension. The room was packed. Homeowners who had once been too scared to question Karen's authority now sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering among themselves, their eyes darting between each other as if they were only just realizing the depths of the corruption they had been living under. At the head of the room, seated in her usual throne-like position, was Karen. She was dressed in a crisp white blazer, her signature bob perfectly in place, hands folded neatly in front of her, as if she wasn't moments away from complete destruction. Her expression was composed, but I could see it in the way her fingers tapped ever so slightly against the polished oak table. She was nervous. I took my seat near the front, setting my folder down with a deliberate thud. Karen's eyes flicked toward it before she turned to address the room, her voice sickly sweet as ever. Before we begin, I just want to remind everyone that HOA meetings are meant to be productive discussions, not arenas for baseless accusations or emotional outbursts. Her gaze landed on me for half a second longer than necessary. We are here to maintain the integrity of our community. I almost laughed. Integrity. That was rich, coming from a woman who had systematically stolen homes under the guise of community improvement. But I let her speak, let her weave her web of false authority, let her pretend she still held the upper hand, because in a few minutes, I was going to rip the floor out from under her. Karen continued droning on about property standards and community expectations, skillfully avoiding any mention of the very real and very illegal sale of my sister's home. When she finally finished her monologue, she leaned back, fixing me with a perfectly neutral expression. Now, I understand that James has some concerns he would like to raise. James, the floor is yours. I stood, clearing my throat, letting the silence stretch for just a moment before I spoke. This isn't about concerns, Karen. It's about fraud. A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. Karen let out a small, breathy chuckle. James, I cut her off, placing the first stack of documents onto the table in front of me. Property records, I said. All of them showing a pattern of fraudulent transfers under your leadership. The Wilsons, the Hendersons, the Johnsons, and now my sister's house. Conveniently seized and sold under bogus violations while the owners were dealing with personal crises. Karen's expression remained composed, but her knuckles had turned white against the edge of the table. These are serious accusations, she said, her voice clipped. They're not accusations, I shot back. They're facts. I pulled out another sheet. Here's an email chain showing how you rerouted official HOA correspondence away from Sarah's email and into a private one controlled by you. Here's a bank statement showing that so-called unpaid fees were being funneled into a shell account registered to Highland Development, your husband's company. I pulled out my phone and hit play. Karen's own voice filled the room, clear as day, laughing about manipulating the system, about how easy it was to push out homeowners who didn't fit the neighborhood's aesthetic. The room erupted. Gasps, outraged whispers, a few homeowners shouting Karen's name in disbelief. Mrs. Rodriguez, one of Karen's most loyal supporters, covered her mouth with a trembling hand. Mr. Thompson, a longtime HOA board member, adjusted his glasses with a shaking hand, glancing at Karen like he was seeing her for the first time. Karen's face was a mask of barely contained rage. This is completely out of context, she sputtered. This is slander. I didn't bother holding back my smirk. Then I'm sure you won't mind if we let the police decide. At that exact moment, as if scripted for a movie, the back doors swung open. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, accompanied by a man in a dark suit, my sister's lawyer. Karen's head snapped toward them so fast I thought her neck might crack. Karen Davidson? One of the officers stepped forward. We have some questions regarding multiple fraudulent property transactions under your HOA's jurisdiction. The color drained from her face. The room exploded into chaos. Homeowners started shouting over each other, some demanding explanations, others turning on the board members who had blindly supported Karen for years. Mr. Thompson stumbled to his feet, frantically wiping his glasses as he turned to the officers. I had no idea about any of this, he stammered. I trusted her. Karen shot up from her chair, her hands slamming against the table. This is absurd. You can't just waltz in here and... Actually, the lawyer cut in smoothly, stepping forward as he placed a thick manila envelope onto the table. We can. He glanced around at the board members. This contains evidence of embezzlement, fraudulent property transfers, and illegal use of HOA funds. We'll be filing a formal lawsuit on behalf of multiple homeowners. Karen's breath hitched. And, the officer continued, we have a warrant to search the HOA office for further documentation. The entire room seemed to freeze. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Then, in a last desperate act, she turned to the board members, forcing out a laugh that sounded more like a strangled cough. This is a witch hunt, she spat. Are you all really going to let this happen? But no one spoke for her. The board members had already shifted away, distancing themselves from her like she was radioactive. Even Mrs. Rodriguez, who had defended her time and time again, was shaking her head, tears pooling in her eyes. You told us everything was legal, she whispered. You lied to us. For the first time since I had walked into that meeting, Karen looked truly afraid. The officers moved forward. Ma'am, please come with us. Karen let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. This is insane, she hissed as they placed a hand on her arm, guiding her toward the door. I built this neighborhood. I made it what it is. And you're all turning on me? She glared at me, her lip curling. You think you've won? You have no idea what you've started. I tilted my head. No, Karen. You did this to yourself. And with that, the officers led her out, her once perfect composure shattered. The queen of the HOA, dragged out in handcuffs for all her loyal subjects to see. As soon as the doors shut behind her, the room remained silent for a beat. Then, one by one, people turned to each other, murmuring in disbelief, in relief, in anger. I glanced at Sarah's lawyer. How long before we can overturn the sale? He smiled. We'll start the process first thing in the morning. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. Karen's reign was over. But I had a feeling this was just the beginning. The morning after Karen's arrest, I stood outside Sarah's house, staring at the moving trucks parked in the driveway. The locks had been changed. The furniture was still inside. Strangers had been scheduled to take possession of a home that had never legally belonged to them. But not today. Not ever. I gripped my phone tightly as Sarah's lawyer arrived, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel as he stepped out of his car. He barely glanced at the moving crew before striding up to me, his face calm but purposeful. We filed the emergency injunction first thing this morning, he said, flipping open his briefcase. The judge agreed, sales invalid. The title never should have been transferred. The house is still in the family trust. As of this moment, Sarah remains the legal owner. Relief flooded through me, but I didn't let my guard down. And what about Karen? The lawyer smirked. She's got bigger problems. Turns out, she was already under investigation. What we handed over just made things worse. They found even more fraudulent transactions in her records. Wire transfers, shell corporations, falsified signatures, you name it. He clicked his briefcase shut. She'll be facing felony charges. I let out a slow breath. Karen had spent years building herself into the most powerful figure in this neighborhood, manipulating laws, bending rules to her will, thinking she was untouchable. And now, she was sitting in a holding cell, watching the empire she built collapse in real time. The moving company's foreman walked up, looking annoyed. So, what's going on here? We were told to move everything out today. I folded my arms. Yeah, well, you were misinformed. The house wasn't legally sold. You're not taking a single thing out of here. He frowned, clearly not paid enough to care. Look, we're just following instructions. If you got a problem, take it up with the buyer. Already did. I pulled out the court order, holding it up. If you so much as touch that front door, you'll be breaking the law. The foreman sighed, rubbed the back of his neck, and turned to his crew. Pack it up, boys. I watched as the trucks rumbled away, a sense of victory settling over me. But I knew this wasn't just about Sarah's house. Karen's downfall was only the tip of the iceberg. Back at the HOA office, a forensic audit was underway. I had barely stepped inside when I saw one of the board members, Mr. Thompson, pacing the floor, looking paler than usual. The other board members were hunched over a table, stacks of financial documents spread in front of them, their expressions ranging from guilty to horrified. Mr. Thompson looked up as I walked in. "James," he said, voice shaky. "We had no idea about the extent of this." I arched an eyebrow. "You expect me to believe that?" He swallowed. We trusted Karen. She handled all the accounts. All the fines. All the sales." He dragged a hand through his thinning hair. "We didn't think to question her. I didn't let him off the hook that easily." "You let her ruin people's lives," I said, voice sharp. "You sat back and watched as she stole homes, drained accounts, destroyed families. And now you want to play innocent." Mrs. Rodriguez sniffled from the corner. "We believed her," she whispered. "We thought she was helping the community." I shook my head. She was helping herself. One of the auditors looked up from the pile of statements. "We've traced over $500,000 in unauthorized transactions," she announced. "HOA dues, fines, and community improvement fees, diverted straight into Karen's personal accounts. This wasn't just real estate fraud. It was full-scale embezzlement." Mr. Thompson sank into a chair, looking like he might faint. "And that's not even the worst part," the auditor continued. "Some of the properties Karen seized were transferred through a secondary entity, one that was flipping them at triple the price." She tapped a document. "This one, bought for a foreclosure price of $80,000, sold a month later for $300,000. And look who signed off on it." I leaned over. There, in neat, confident handwriting, was Karen's signature. I exhaled sharply. "How long do you think she's looking at?" The auditor tilted her head. "Hard to say. But with everything we've found, she's going away for a long time." I turned back to the board members, watching as the weight of their complicity settled on them. "So what happens now?" I asked. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, glancing at the others before looking back at me. "New elections," he said. "We're dissolving the current board. The homeowners will vote on new leadership." He hesitated. Would your sister be interested?" I let out a dry laugh. "Sarah's had enough HOA nightmares to last a lifetime." Mr. Thompson nodded. "Then maybe you?" I froze. The last thing I had ever wanted was to get involved in the ridiculous world of HOAs, but looking at the mess Karen had left behind, at the neighbors who had been bullied, manipulated, and lied to for years, I realized someone had to make sure this never happened again. "I'll think about it," I said finally. 2 weeks later, Sarah officially got her house back. The locks were changed again, this time by someone she actually trusted. The neighbors, many of whom had been too afraid to stand up to Karen before, stopped by with food, flowers, even offers to help repaint the door she had once been fined for. And as we stood on the porch that evening, looking out at the neighborhood that had finally been freed from Karen's iron grip, Sarah nudged me. "You know," she said, a teasing smile on her lips, "Mom always said you'd end up running things around here." I groaned. "Don't start." She laughed. "I'm just saying, people trust you. And let's be honest, you'd love the chance to make Karen's legacy nothing more than a bad memory." I looked out at the street, at the families who had once lived in fear of ridiculous fines and arbitrary rules, now reclaiming their homes, their voices. Maybe she was right. Maybe this wasn't just about winning. Maybe this was about fixing what had been broken. As the sun set over the neighborhood, I made a decision. Karen had ruled with greed, fear, and manipulation. It was time for something different. Karen thought she was untouchable. What was her biggest mistake that led to her downfall? If you could add another unexpected twist to the story, what would it be? Do you think the HOA board members were truly unaware of Karen's scheme? Or were they just ignoring it for their own benefit? What's the most ridiculous HOA rule you've ever heard of? Drop it in the comments. If this story were turned into a movie, who would you cast as Karen and James? Would you ever consider running for an HOA board to prevent something like this from happening? Why or why not? What's one thing you think HOAs shouldn't have control over when it comes to homeowners?